My husband was on Facebook and saw this article that you wrote and immediately showed it to me because I am certain this is the creature I saw 8 years ago in 2011 around the same time of year, which is winter, when I was on my way to work. The events unfolded as such. I was driving down Road 1 in between 400 and 500 South. Now this location is in Randolph County, just 10 to 15 minutes kind of east from Prairie Creek Reservoir. This is why the article caught my husband's attention from the beginning. Anyway, as I was driving, I saw what appeared to be a human crouched down on the road. As I got closer, and the more I slowed down, it did not move. So, I was at a complete stop. This thing slowly turned its head to look my way, and it had greenish yellowish-like eyes, like the color of a cat's eyes. It stared for maybe 3 seconds and then proceeded to slowly get up from its position, like a human would stand up because it had legs. It turned towards my car. It stepped on my car and used it to take off. Then it lifted off like a glider towards the sky. I turned my head just in time to see it tuck its legs into its body. So it did appear as a bird in flight, kind of. Its wingspan was wider than anything I've ever seen on any animal in my life. I told my husband what had happened, and he told me that it had to have been a bird, until he saw this article. I've never said anything to anyone else in fear that I would be made out to be an idiot. I would also still like to maintain my privacy, as I do not want any public attention from this, as I have had a young daughter and do not want her to be brought into it either. I hope you will all maintain my privacy as well as keep my involvement to just a witness level. I got a quick sighting. My boss, we're at work right now, I called for him a couple times during like a UFO episode. I'm pretty sure he lives in a hot spot. It's right next to a reservation land, or a conservation land that used to be a military shooting range in the Civil War. And he's the last house in the cul-de-sac, so his yard is right next to the woods. And I believe it's a portal. And one day this past summer, he had lit a fire around duskish when the sun went down, and he turned his head and saw this little, like 3 or 4 foot, naked, hairy, like feral child or little gremlin type thing. And I know we were talking earlier tonight about a horseman, but he had like a kind of like shaggy hair almost. And then his hair went back down to his neck, like a horseman almost, and he was kind of hunched over. And he kind of galloped off, and when they checked for footprints, there were none. In September 1978, I lived with my father on a farm in the vicinity of Shawano, Wisconsin, which is very near an Indian reservation. There had been some buzz within the community of an unknown large hairy creature spotted by 2 deer hunters not far from our farm. I had heard stories of the local tribes and stories told by the local Indians, but I just considered these tales to be legends. And then one evening, my father and I were coming home from the store and noticed what appeared to be 2 hairy creatures collecting squash from the garden. Each creature was at least 6 foot tall. It was dusk, but there was just enough light to clearly see what they were doing. My father immediately cut the headlights and stopped the car, as we just sat there and watched them pick and eat the squash. They didn't seem to even notice us, even though we were literally only about 100 feet from them. After about 5 minutes, one of the creatures looked in our direction, and you could see its eyes glow red from the moonlight. We started to get scared and decided to make a dash for the house and call the police. And then suddenly, a huge disc-shaped object appeared above us and slowly moved towards the east field, which was about 200 yards from us, and landed. I estimate the craft was about 40 feet in diameter. A large sliding door opened immediately, and a foggy green light glowed from within the craft. After a few seconds, the door closed and the craft slowly rose and shot off towards the north. Then, we noticed that the creatures were gone. A few days later, our neighbors from down the road came over for dinner. After we finished eating, my father and Mr. C walked outside. After only about an hour or so, the neighbors left and I started to clean up and just clean up around the kitchen in general. Later that evening, though, I was watching TV in the living room. My father walked in, turned off the TV, and sat down beside me. He told me that Mr. C and his sister witnessed one of the craft on the same night that we had our encounter. As well, they witnessed several of the large, hairy creatures meandering in the nearby woods. Mr. C said that he knew something had been in the woods for several weeks, but never got a good look until the craft arrived. After that night, we never had another encounter, or did we hear of more sightings by any people in the area. Do you think that these creatures were Bigfoot, aliens, or one and the same? It has always seemed strange to me that a Bigfoot body has never been found, but is it a possibility that Bigfoot is an extraterrestrial being? So, when I was younger, I had to stay home alone a lot, and it never really bothered me. I was about 11 at the time this happened, and it was rainy, and it was a rainy evening after school. It was probably about 6 o'clock, and it was around spring. I remember because I had flower pots sitting on the windowsill that I was waiting for to bloom patiently. I was sitting in bed reading at the time, and I heard tapping on my bedroom window. I blamed the sound on the storm happening outside, although it sounded like a person tapping at the window. I heard it again, this time more frantic and loud. At this point, I knew it had to be some sort of person, but scared me that they weren't knocking on the front door, and I figured that I was in my room. When I opened the window curtains back, there was a tall, dark figure. It had dark eyes, a white face, and really no other discernible features due to its cloak. The damn thing motioned for me to open the window. I was terrified and young, so my stupid ass opened the window like, maybe if I see what it wants, it will go away. It picked up one of the flower pots on my window and handed it to me. Its hand was pitch black and it had inhumanely long fingers. I took the flower pot and, not looking away from the thing, set it down. It then proceeded to hand me the other 2 pots for me to take inside and pointed to the sky, as if to be like, get your flowers inside, it's storming. I nodded and said thanks, with the shakiest, most trembling voice. It nodded and turned away from my window and towards the street. It levitated off the ground a few inches and floated down the street and floated towards the woods. I shut my window after that, locked all my doors, and tried to figure out what I just saw. I never saw it again after that, but I also stopped playing in those woods it disappeared into. 7 years ago, I was camping near my local town here in Mexico. I was part of a brigade of Boy Scouts, and I remember that one of our leaders invited us to explore the forest. After 30 minutes of looking for some wood, the leader gave us an alert that in front of us an old man was doing something strange. This was weird because people weren't able to enter the forest after 8 p.m., so we were really confused about his presence. We were there because the leader reserved the place to give us a special badge. The badges are kind of different here in Mexico, so this is one that was about exploration, using camping material and teamwork. Anyway, after staring at the old man, he put himself in a crouched position, and after 5 minutes the old man disappeared, and the only thing that was in front of us was a big dog with blue eyes. We started running back to the camp to tell the other kids what we had just witnessed. The oldest member of our brigade told us the story of a creature called a Nahal. It's a Mexican legend that states that special persons can transform into certain animals with a specific purpose. Others say that they are lost spirits trying to search peace in the afterlife. That night, the leaders decided to move the tents to a little bunker up the hill. In the night, all the kids were paranoid about the events, so they decided that we were going to be safer in a little bunker. After that experience, the brigade decided that the exploration badge was going to be canceled for some time indefinitely. This encounter happened last night while I was hiking with my husband and son. We went hiking to this spot in South Cali where we've been going for the last 13 years. The hiking trails are basically located all along the cliff. Some trails lead to a secluded beach, while others lead to a cave. We took the trail that leads to the beach, and we usually keep walking longer than the average person since we are more familiar with the terrain after the trail ends. Around 4:30 p.m., we decided to hike back up the trail while watching the sunset. At the same time, the moon was rising on the opposite direction. This moon was huge, probably one of the biggest moons I've seen, and this is where we took some pictures. We decided that once we got back to the top of the trail, around 5:30ish p.m., to keep hiking along some other trail which we've only been to once. The night was still young, and plenty of families were walking among this trail. I decided to take a quick break after a short jog to enjoy the scenery and appreciate the moon. At this time, my husband and son were pretty far from me and I could see their silhouettes. The night was now upon us, and the fog from the Pacific Ocean was making its way up the cliff into the hiking trails. My husband and son decided to turn back and meet me because it was getting dark. My son began to run past us. At this point, my husband looks towards his direction and sees this black silhouette of a tall person standing about 9 meters from my son. As soon as this thing notices that my husband is looking at it, it gets on all fours and takes off like an animal. He yells for my son to come back. He then tells me what he saw and says something is running across the trail. I am scared of dogs, so first thing I thought was a stray dog running loose. And he says no, it's bigger than a dog. Almost like the size of a bear, but it had the silhouette of a man standing in the middle of the trail, and it took off on all fours as soon as I looked at it. He said this thing was darker than the dark around us. At this point, we were freaking the hell out. We were hugging each other, not knowing what to expect next. We were basically in the middle of a trail we've only been once with shitty phone service. We've looked around and the trail was completely empty with no one to be seen. We were basically the only ones there. That trail went from being packed with people to now us three being the only ones there within minutes, which made everything even more terrifying. We decided to suck it up and walk back to our car, which meant we had to pass by where my husband saw this thing on the trail. My husband said he thought he saw this humanoid run down the trail, but once we got to that spot where he saw it, the trail turned right, but the figure ran left. To the left was a fence and a bunch of tall bushes, making it impossible for something to go that way. Whatever it was would have to have jumped the fence to keep going the way it went. We never saw or heard it jump the fence, and better yet, we didn't hear its footsteps or anything moving in the bushes. My husband said it just disappeared. We managed to keep walking along the trail while holding his phone flashlight, pointed at the fence and bushes where he saw it go towards. All I had was my water bottle, and I was ready to use it as a weapon. All we could hope for this time was to see other people along the trail. Then we finally see lights coming from a motorbike towards the end of the trail, and this person was going into the trail as we were relieved to be out of it and into the parking lot. When we finally got to the parking lot, it went by from only 50 cars to 2 cars left. There was this couple outside taking pictures, and at this point, even the person in the motorbike noped back out this trail and back to the parking lot and left. As we made our way back to the car, I kind of joked with my husband about how he might have seen a werewolf. He was still in shock and didn't say no, but he was still trying to process what he had seen. My son said he saw something crawling, and that's when my husband called him to come back towards us. He was really scared that night and refused to sleep by himself. We all slept in the same room anyway, and my son said he felt like it was following us the whole time home. I hope not. Today, we ended up watching this segment on the news by accident while having dinner, and we heard that today is a super blood wolf moon. Now I am 90% convinced he saw a werewolf. This location is notorious for many deaths, as it is on a cliff where many have died from falling over or drowned. When we went there for the first time, there was a sign around about a person who fell off the cliff. This happened a few years ago at my parents' house, in a small town in Wayne County. Anyone that knows the area knows some parts are very rural. Well, my parents live right in town, not far from the center of it, but in a weird spot. The town only has maybe like 500 people in the town limits, and it's surrounded by farmland and forests. They live right near the railroad tracks and canal, and their backyard is pitch black at night because of the streetlights. This happened a few years ago at my parents' house in a small town in Wayne County. Anyone that knows the area knows some parts are very rural. Well, my parents live right in town, not far from the center of it, but in a weird spot. The town only has maybe like 500 people in the town limits, and it's surrounded by farmland and forests. They live right near the railroad tracks and canal, and their backyard is pitch black at night because the streetlights don't even reach back there. The yard backs up to a walking trail and woods. It's actually pretty creepy back there after dark, even though it's only 2 blocks from downtown. The night this story takes place, it was extremely dark. I think it was a new moon or maybe a moonless night, and it was overcast to boot. Late summer or early fall, so it was pretty dry, no mud yet to capture any footprints. My parents, brother, and I were talking in the living room and at the front of the house. The part of the house facing town and light. The house is kind of long and skinny, maybe 30 or 40 feet wide, but probably 120 to 150 feet long. As we're talking, the family dog stood up, looked around, and started to growl really low. He was a yellow lab, about 90 pounds, half deaf and blind from diabetes. Overall, he was a really chill dog. He'd never bark at other dogs and very rarely bark at people. That's what made this so odd. His cackles went up and he started barking towards the back of the house. There are at least 2 closed doors before you even get to the room where the back door is. The dog is now like full-on berserk, barking at the closed door in the hallway. We opened it and followed him to see why he was going nuts. We get to the door to the back room and we are now worried someone had broke in. But when we opened it, Marley shot straight to the back door, jumping and barking and snarling, making sounds I've never heard this big baby of a dog make. I opened the back door and he tried to bolt out. He was going to attack whoever or whatever was out there. Me and my parents step out on the back porch and close Marley inside. He still sounds almost fucking rabid. We wait a second for our eyes to adjust because the backyard is so pitch black. We see a silhouette maybe 40 or 50 feet away, standing at the edge of the yard right near the railroad tracks or access road. Now, to say this thing was big is an understatement. It was way over 6 feet tall. Probably closer to 7.5 or so, maybe even 8 feet tall and extremely broad. I'd think it was a potential burglar that we caught sneaking up to the house if it wasn't so fucking massive. My parents to this day swear it was a black bear. Officially, according to the DEC. Black bears don't live anywhere near this area and haven't for a long time. Also, the size of it would have to be a record-sized black bear. Also, the reaction of my dog going nuts doesn't seem like what a bear would do. After we put Marley inside, it just stood there, upright, for about 2 minutes before we decided it was best to go inside, as the hairs on our necks were standing up. This story that happened to a very close friend of mine, and I found it interesting so that I wanted to share it online. It is written in his perspective. This incident occurred sometime in the fall of '06, and I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it, and as a child I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to the incident, I had wandered through those woods many, many times before, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular, though, that I frequently enjoyed to climb, usually about to the halfway mark so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Now naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes, and I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sunset until I could no longer see it, I began to see my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name. I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. And then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground. My mother's voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods, rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home. My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. And that's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into the woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name, but there was something strange about it. She sounded almost absolutely frantic, almost angry. Fearing that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place, and as her voice drew closer, I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly, I heard her voice calling my name from the direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again. It wasn't an echo, and I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our backyard, as well as ahead of me. My legs suddenly turned to jelly, and I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. "Come here, right now!" The voice that I originally believed to be her screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that just unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far from where I had been standing, those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did in that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name, now sounding desperate. Panic set in as my actual mother finally came into view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely inside of the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she hadn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no, although I was still very much shaken up, and I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods have stayed with me to this day, and I could still hear that voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever it was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. And not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off. Not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. And I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because I was stated before, we lived in a rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there, and I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger or possibly a demon, but I'm unsure. If anyone has a possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it. Thank you.